Joining us to debate this idea are two guests with deep knowledge of the issue. John Herbst is a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He is one of the signatories of a letter urging the Biden administration and NATO to establish a no-fly zone. Ambassador Herbst, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Also with us is Dr. Robert Farley, a senior lecturer at the University of Kentucky's Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. He studies air power, and he is against the idea of a no-fly zone, limited or otherwise. Dr. Farley, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Since this is a debate, I should just lay out two very simple rules, neither of which I believe either of you will violate. One, no personal attacks. Two, no soliloquies. Please keep your answers as pointed and to the point as possible, because we have a lot of ground to cover. Starting, Ambassador, with you, since you are for the resolution, as it were, give me your one strongest argument in favor of a no-fly zone.
Well, again, I've advocated not a straight no-fly zone, but a humanitarian air corridor with air cover. And right now, Russian air power is murdering civilians intentionally, preventing civilians from leaving areas which they are pounding and preventing supplies from getting in. People in Mariupol are dying of now not just bombs, but also the absence of food, the absence of medical supplies. So I follow up an idea developed by General Phil Breedlove and Ambassador Kurt Volker for a humanitarian no-fly zone or a humanitarian corridor supported by air power, which would enable convoys to go in and enable civilians to come out. And this is just a follow-up on something we did in Georgia when Moscow invaded Georgia in 2008, and we sent in humanitarian supplies by both plane and by ship.
Right. Dr. Farley, what is your one strongest argument against a no-fly zone?
Well, I mean, I'll be straightforward. I think that the humanitarian corridor no-fly zone is completely unworkable from a technical and operational standpoint. If American aircraft are flying through a humanitarian corridor or attempting to defend a humanitarian corridor, they will be targeted and painted by Russian surface-to-air missile systems, both in Russia and in Ukraine. This will require them to engage those systems and to fire anti-radiation missiles, which will mean killing Russians immediately. The Russians also have air-to-air missiles, so their aircraft can launch missiles from Russia that can reach NATO aircraft in the no-fly zone. The Russians also have surface-to-air missile systems that they can base in Russia that will be able to control the no-fly zone. So it'll immediately put U.S. and NATO aircraft in danger without actually preventing any of the attacks that the ambassador is suggesting would be prevented.
Ambassador, what about that? I hear what Dr. Farley is saying in terms of the potential, the dramatically higher potential for there to be contact between Western countries and Russia, even if that corridor is intended to be humanitarian.
The only problem with his answer, he ignored what I said at the end of my first statement, which is we did something similar, not exactly the same like this in Georgia, without incident. Moscow has already has its hands full dealing with Ukrainian forces. It does really not want to deal with NATO forces as well, which are far stronger than Russia's conventional military. So what I'm suggesting would put the onus on Moscow to essentially launch an attack on our aircraft. The professor's right that our planes would be at risk. They could, quote unquote, be painted. But it's also true that the greater risk lies with the Kremlin. And we've done something similar before.
With regard to what we're dealing with now, Ambassador Herbst, do you think that the thought process in Russia now is the same as it was in Georgia then? I mean, a lot of people have kind of questioned whether Vladimir Putin is playing by any kind of a rule book that would lead him to make logical, tactical decisions. If he made logical, tactical decisions, some would argue, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations right now.
I can't rule out what you've said, but what I can tell you for sure is that Putin has threatened escalation, including nuclear escalation, over a variety of issues. And we have been intimidated by that. That's why the administration made the very bad decision not to send those MiGs from Poland to Ukraine. If Putin realizes by threatening he can get us to stop defending our interests, what's to stop him from moving on the Baltic states, which happen to be NATO allies? So we need to understand that we're a superpower too, and we in fact are more powerful in all ways in Russia with the exception of nuclear power, where we are equals. And we were able to manage a much more difficult danger coming from the Soviet Union when we had to defend our interests in Berlin in '61 and in Cuba in '62.
Dr. Farley, with regard to the impact of this, there seems to be some growing public support for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. There was a Reuters poll from a few weeks ago that put public support at 74%. A CBS News poll put it at 59%. I've seen Quinnipiac polls that show even higher support if this should happen to involve NATO allies in terms of putting boots on the ground. I think one of the arguments that the Ukrainians have made, and I'm paraphrasing, trying to simplify, but that the West is kind of afraid to get its nose bloody in a war where we are superior military power and children are being killed in buildings that have the word children written in big white letters to try to save their lives. If not this, then what else?
So that sounds to me like we must do something, and this is something, so we ought to do it. The fact is that most of the outrages being committed by the Russian military right now are being done by artillery. Russia has enough artillery to incinerate every city in Ukraine. It can incinerate Kharkiv, it can incinerate Kiev, and every other city. It doesn't need air power. Most of the Russian air power that is actually engaged in attacks in Ukraine so far would not at all be covered by a no-fly zone, because Russian aircraft are firing from the Russian side of the border standoff munitions that are landing in Ukraine. And so to have a no-fly zone, the United States Air Force would need to engage Russian aircraft flying in Russian airspace before they fired their very long-range missiles, which can strike all over Ukraine. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough that this makes no sense. And to talk about the polling, there was a wonderful poll, and it escapes my mind just now, but once it was explained to the people who were being polled what a no-fly zone meant, that it meant direct engagement against Russian aircraft, support for the no-fly zone fell from the 60s into the 30s. And that's the problem here, right? People don't know what this term means. It sounds like something that ought to be done, but in fact, it's incredibly dangerous.
Ambassador, what about that? I think the idea that a lot of people have in mind is that if you have this no-fly zone, like if this space, this box I'm in right now, is a no-fly zone, that you're trying to stop weapons being dropped like this instead of weapons being fired like this from outside in. And the prospect of Western and NATO planes having to fly into Russian airspace where these attacks are originating, does that change your thought process at all on whether this is feasible?
You know, Phil Breedlove was a four-star Air Force general, and it was his idea. So he understands the military repercussions of this very well. The whole idea is to protect a convoy, which our planes would be, our NATO planes would be over, and the Russians would understand they leave that convoy alone. Whether that convoy is going in with medical supplies and food, or whether it's coming out with civilians from an area which is being struck by artillery from where it's being fired. And so the Russians would understand if they attacked that convoy, our planes would respond. I suspect in that case, they probably would leave the convoy alone. And the whole idea is to save lives. The one thing we know for sure is if we don't take steps like this, more civilians will die in large numbers. And again, we sent humanitarian shipments into Georgia when Russia was conducting a war against Georgia, and there were no incidents. We sent a Navy ship with humanitarian supplies into Georgian ports during that same war without repercussion.
I just want to be clear, Ambassador, because I hear what you're describing, and I don't want people to conflate what you're describing with what I think President Zelensky is describing. He sounds like he's describing something that is much more far-reaching than a specific kind of a contoured no-fly zone that goes right over a humanitarian convoy, protects it, and then presumably disbands once that convoy has made it safely in. I don't think that would be enough for President Zelensky. I don't think that's what he asked for. Do you think that there is a viable case for what the Ukrainians are actually asking for?
That's a very good question. And you would have to ask President Zelensky if that's what he has in mind. But what I can tell you is this, and this I know with precision. He initially called for a no-holds-barred, no-fly zone, the type the professor described, the type that I do not support, because that would require us to take preemptive strikes at Russian military installations. But during his speech to our Congress, apparently he'd been watching the debate in the United States, because he's a smart man, and he called for a humanitarian no-fly zone. How precisely that jibes with what I've described, again, we have to talk to him.
I am hearing a bit of overlap from the two of you. It sounds like neither of you is in support of a kind of a broader no-fly zone over all of Ukraine. Ambassador, I hear you saying you support a much more targeted no-fly zone to protect humanitarian aid. Dr. Farley, with regards to other alternatives, though, the Biden administration announced this week $800 million more support on top of what's already been pledged. That brings it up to $1 billion. You can see an array of different kinds of arms and munitions, body armor, Javelin anti-armor systems, which have been described as one of the more useful munitions we could send because they would help take out tanks, which have been a significant part of the Russian onslaught so far. If not a no-fly zone, is something like this the next best thing, Doctor, or would you concede that there are some things that only an actual no-fly zone can do?
I mean, the only thing a no-fly zone can do right now is get us much closer to a very significant escalation, especially given the Russian artillery dominance. I absolutely support giving more aid to Ukraine right now. We are working on transferring long-range surface-to-air missile systems like the S-300, other systems that NATO countries have and could possibly pass over to the Ukrainians that could substantially improve their control over their own airspace. The British are sending surface-to-air missiles. I think that the MiG deal in the long term is possibly workable and is something we should be looking at rather than sort of junking it right now. But the idea that we're going to fly American fighters to the outskirts of Kharkiv and the Russians aren't going to do anything about it, I mean, I think it's not only dangerous, it's also absurd.
Ambassador, you were in support of the idea, so I'm going to give you the last word since your side has the burden of proof before we go.
Well, I think we've delineated the differences. We both agree against a large no-fly zone. We both think we should provide much more military support to Ukraine. And we disagree regarding the humanitarian corridor no-fly zone. But as I said, this is not a crazy idea. We've done a good bit of it before without mishap.
I should note, by the way, that Estonia has become the first NATO member to actually call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Its parliament passed a measure yesterday demanding that. Ambassador John Herbst, Dr. Robert Farley, this has been extremely helpful, at least to me, in thinking through what this idea of a no-fly zone might be. Gentlemen, we appreciate you both making time tonight. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.